So welcome and thanks for joining us on this webinar. My understanding is that we have about 178 people who thought this topic was important enough to sit in on, and that's encouraging. You won't be disappointed. A little context about me and Significant Matters will help you better understand what we're hoping to accomplish in this webinar and the ones to come. My name is Tom Bassford, and I'm the founder and president of Significant Matters, and we've been around as an organization for 15 years. And before that, I pastored for 32 years. So I have a deep love for the church and the work of missions through the church. Our purpose as an organization is to help churches reframe their missions work around sustainable solutions and create room for business-minded people who can help that happen. We help churches rethink the way they do missions. Through our workshops, our peer learning accelerators, and SAT Talks, we connect your church to a network of peers and partners and resources committed to advancing missions beyond the helping that hurts narrative. About 6 years ago, we started doing a TED Talk type of an event called SAT Talks as a way to tell the stories of pioneers across the world who are exploring new ways to address material poverty and its effects through church missions. And we have over 60 videos of folks like Bob Lupton, Michael Matheson Miller, Florence Muindi, and a whole host of others. And I'll tell you a little bit more about those and how you can access them at the end. As we're all painfully aware, with this pandemic, this year we were unable to do our SAT Talks event. And in the conversation that I was having with the Faith to Action folks, we began talking about the possibility of doing a webinar, which grew into an idea of doing maybe a series of webinars, of which this is the first one. What we imagined was pretty simple. Let's get a panel of expert practitioners around a specific area of mission work and let them share their thoughts and best practices with the American church. And I wanted to ask the simple question as part of this conversation: what do you need most from the American church? So with that as a backdrop, let's jump into a conversation on how the American church can best care for orphans and vulnerable children impacted by COVID-19. We're in the middle of a global pandemic and lives are being significantly impacted locally and globally. And with the highest number of cases and deaths in the world, the U.S. church is facing major challenges, including economic uncertainty, navigating online services, and serving the vulnerable in their own communities. And while we've been trying to do that, countries around the world are also struggling, suffering the impact of the virus itself, and perhaps more significant, suffering from secondary impacts. Quarantine and isolation are causing dangerous situations for children, and extreme economic strain is putting already vulnerable families in places of desperation. I remember the first article I saw was in April of this year, and Oxfam suggested that upwards of 500 million people worldwide could be forced back into extreme poverty because of COVID-19. That would set the world back at least a decade, and in many places 30 years in its fight on poverty. Yesterday I was listening to a report, and the Africa Centers for Disease Control and Prevention stated that COVID-19 pandemic in Africa is only now reaching full speed, with confirmed cases across Africa surpassing the 500,000 milestone. The worst is yet to come. Individuals and whole communities that live day to day, hand to mouth, have no safety net and literally no means to provide for their own families. And for any of us who've spent time in the barrios and townships across the world, it's not hard to imagine the devastating impact this is having and will have long after life has gone back to whatever the new normal will be for those of us on this webinar. More specifically for this webinar, what about the children? Risk factors for violence, exploitation, and abuse historically rise for children living under restricted movement and socioeconomic decline. And there's every indication that's happening now. In a policy brief on the impact of COVID-19 on children from the UN, they wrote, "Now is the time to step up international solidarity for children and humanity, and to lay the foundations for a deeper transformation of the way we nurture and invest in our world's youngest generation." It's important that we, the church, find ways to support suffering children and families around the world, and that we do it well. And like Significant Matters, the Faith to Action initiative exists to be a resource to and to provide an education to American churches. Faith to Action's focus is on how to care for vulnerable children as we respond to our biblical call to care for the orphan. In my conversation with Faith to Action, I've learned that it would be healthy for us to examine the approaches that we've taken historically in responding to that call, and that there are some things that we can improve our methods on. I'm excited for the panel that we've put together. It's a panel of expert practitioners with us here today to help us understand and respond to the global impact of COVID-19 on orphans and vulnerable children. We're going to start the conversation today with Rebecca Knepp, joining us from Australia, 6 o'clock in the morning, thereabouts, if I'm right. Welcome, Rebecca. There you are. Rebecca represents an organization called the Better Care Network, and she's the Senior Technical Advisor. Rebecca, tell us a little bit about the Better Care Network, the goals.
Absolutely. Well, it's great to be with you today, and thank you for including me in this conversation. And yes, the Better Care Network is a global network, and it's comprised of many amazing organizations who all collaborate and advocate together to promote family-based care for children. And we're part of what we call internally the care reform sector, which is all about transforming the care systems in countries all over the world away from a high dependence on residential care, which includes institutions like orphanages or children's villages or children's homes, towards systems that actually prevent children from being separated from their families due to things like poverty or education or lack of services, and to also ensure that children who can't remain with their parents or their own families, despite support or other means, that they can also live in family settings with extended family or with other families such as foster care. So we are, as a network, all about promoting evidence-based practice and policy. And importantly, what we see there is that the evidence shows us that residential care institutions are not the best environments for children. They're not environments that promote healthy development and provide opportunities for healthy development for children. And we see that residential care environments, which are highly overused in so many countries and proliferated, that they are associated with poorer outcomes for children and a range of risks and detriments that include cognitive developmental delays, emotional delays, attachment issues, behavioral issues, poorer mental health outcomes, and that they also impact children and young people's sense of identity and their sense of belonging. And so what we see is that even high quality residential care institutions or settings, they might be able to meet children's physical needs, their need for food and shelter and education, but they're really poorly equipped to meet children's emotional and psychological needs. And that can have lasting impacts and detriments that children can carry into their adulthood and when they leave those institutions and go back out into society. And the other really key piece of evidence that drives the care reforms that the Better Care Network is involved in is the evidence that shows us that the vast majority of children who are in these residential care institutions aren't there because that they don't have caregivers. We often call them orphanages, which creates an assumption that these children are orphans, but the data shows us that 80% of these children across the world aren't actually orphans, that they do have caregivers. And oftentimes it's not that their caregivers can't care for them or don't want to care for them, it's that they need support to be able to do that. And so it is the drivers like education and poverty and disability and a lack of community services that often means these children are being relinquished and placed in these institutions. And so all of that evidence shows us that we need to shift the way that we are approaching children's care, the way that we are supporting our children in overseas countries. And that is what this care reform movement that a Better Care Network is a part of is really all about. And there's some of the reasons that are driving these reforms across the world.
I think one of the startling things, and then I've heard it now for years, but I remember the first time that I heard it, that 80% of the children worldwide in residential orphanage care have a parent that is still living. And you know what? What it struck to me was that oftentimes the most intuitive thing that comes to our mind in terms of helping is not necessarily the long-term best thing. I mean, the intuitive thing to do when you see people suffering is to meet that need in the most direct way possible. And yet, if you kind of walk it back a little bit, it kind of makes sense that parents might bring their children to residential orphanages if they thought their kid would have a better. Does that make sense to you?
Absolutely. That's what we see happening all the time. In fact, you know, there's a saying that you can sometimes hear within our sector that's saying we don't have an orphan crisis. We actually have an orphanage crisis. And oftentimes the orphanage comes before the orphan. It's the presence of a service that can provide some of the things that these families desperately need. You know, when we locate services like, you know, food, shelter, or education, or financial support, when we locate those services inside of an institution and we make a child being resident in that institution the requirement for that child and that family to access that support, we actually incentivize that separation. And we pull children who are in need, families who have needs, but we pull those children out of their families in order to access supports. And so it often creates the separation that we actually think the orphanage is responding to in the first place. And so it flips the issue around. And there are some children in orphanages or in residential care that don't have parents. There are some children who do have parents, but it may not be safe at that point in time for them to be with their parents or that family. But that still doesn't mean the only option for those children is an orphanage. There are a range of other options that are part of the continuum of care that we need to be promoting because of what we know about the detriments of institutions.
Yeah. So I think one of the phrases that I've heard from the folks at Poverty Cure is it's one thing to have a heart for the poor. We also have to have a mind for the poor. And I think the world as a whole is grappling better and better with that. And I would even say the church is beginning to grapple with that a little bit. We've always known the church has a great heart for the marginalized, the vulnerable, the poor, and all of those sorts of things. But I think one of the things that's happening to the church today is that we're being challenged with the notion that we've got to do the evidence-based thing that you're saying. And to rely on evidence is not to deny the presence of God or what he might want to do. I would argue quite the opposite, which then brings me to another question about you. You work for the Better Care Network, which is not necessarily a faith-based group.
No, it's not. No, it's a secular organization.
And one of the things that I have found interesting now on the Faith to Action website, I know that all the emails that I get from Megan, at the very bottom, there's a little video on there that has Florence Martin, who's the director of the Better Care Network. And I remember the first time I was watching that video, about midway through came in Dr. Dahlia Pop. Did I say her name right?
Yes.
And in that, I was so delighted because oftentimes I'll hear pastors just kind of wringing their hands about how the world has marginalized the church. The North American church isn't wanted at the table. And I think, no. They may not want us at the table in some of the ways that we've been there before, but if we'll kind of reform our ways. And Dahlia Pop said something something to the effect of, Faith to Action Initiative is connected with churches and other organizations that bring different perspectives. And then she says, my organization is not a faith-based organization, but I always feel welcome. And there's a learning process, and we so appreciate the Faith to Act. So just speak for a minute on how welcome you are. You don't hide the fact that you're a Christian. Faith to Action Initiative doesn't hide the fact. I mean, they are. How has the non-faith-based world embraced you in this space?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because there is often, and historically, I'd say, as you pointed to, more so it's been that way, that there's been this separation between the faith-based world and the secular world in international development, in, you know, child protection and this area of children's care more specifically. And it's felt that they were sort of separate and fragmented, right, and unable to collaborate. And particularly, you know, many faith actors have felt like they would be vilified at the table, or that their faith would be denied, that they wouldn't have that opportunity to really practice through their faith if they were part of that broader table. For me, as a person of faith and a very open person of faith, I'm actually a credentialed pastor in our church movement in Australia, and I have, when I first started this work, there was a little bit of that sentiment, but the only thing that was required to overcome it was to really demonstrate that I'm committed to best practice. And for me personally, as a Christian, I think I absolutely should be at the forefront of being committed to best practice. That's for me part of showing my faith in practice, in work, is that I want to do the best I can for these kids, for these families, for these communities. When I work with governments in other countries, we want to bring our absolute best to the table. And I think it's just that aspect of saying, I am going to connect my head and my heart together. I am going to, bring the whole of me to the table and engage with this. And that was really the only thing that it took to overcome that barrier for people to see, who weren't faith actors, to see, actually, we can have the whole conversation with Rebecca and with her colleagues at, when I was working with an organization that was a faith-based organization. So people want the faith community at the table, because we all recognize that the faith communities actually provide a huge proportion of the services in many, many countries. So they're an absolutely critical actor, and we want to collaborate. So I think it's just about finding that common ability to do so and our commonalities and working from that point.
Thank you for that. So let me ask another question. With this global pandemic and the hardship, can you share with us how we need to pivot from our responses from the past? I mean, you've seen the church response to the AIDS pandemic, the Haiti earthquake, Ebola. What do we need to learn from those and change? How could they inform what's ahead of us in this pandemic?
Absolutely. I think it's always so important when we are responding to a new crisis, a new emergency. It's always important to be, forward thinking in our response, but learn from where we've been, because there are so many lessons from the past, and we've got to make sure we're not repeating the same mistakes over and over again. And what we have seen in the past experiences, with whether it's the HIV/AIDS crisis, whether it's Ebola, whether it's the earthquake in Haiti, the earthquake in Nepal, or the tsunami in the Indian Ocean, what we saw in all of those events was an influx of money and new aid actors, a lot coming from the faith-based community, bringing money in to establish new institutions in these countries. And it was, a combination. What we saw was this combination of the way the media often reports these events, the sensationalization that's inherent to media. We would see these reports of huge inflated numbers of children who are orphaned by the earthquake or by the tsunami or by this event. And, media reports showing these isolated children and giving us outside of the country this sense that, oh my gosh, there's all these children, they're alone, there's nobody caring for them, they're desperate. And we look at that and we attach it to our existing assumptions that orphanages are the answer to vulnerable children, and we rush in with all this, resource that is directed towards institutions, whether that's scaling up the number of children in the existing institutions or whether it's starting a host of new ones. And all of those past examples, we saw that take place. What we saw on the ground happen is that over time, those numbers came right down. Once tracing was happening, once identification systems were put into place, the numbers of actual orphan children dropped right down. And we found that most of those actually orphan children were already in their community and in their family. And the majority of children who came into institutions set up to deal with, a perception of orphanhood crisis actually created secondary separation issues. So children coming out of families being recruited by orphanages who now had all of this resource that they needed to expend for orphans in an institution, it lured children out of their families and into these institutions, and families who now had their livelihoods disrupted, who may have been trying to rebuild houses that were damaged or cope with the death of one family member and the disruption that causes. They now were being encouraged to place these children into these institutions. And the data shows us that they stayed there for in many, many cases for the remainder of their childhood. So this was not a temporary situation. you know, 10 years, 15 years later, in some instances, we're still trying to transition those institutions that were set up for those purposes. So we need to learn that in this situation, we need to respond differently. We need to have the same heart. We need to have the same response in terms of saying, I am going to give, I am going to invest for the sake of others overseas who are in a much more difficult situation than I am. But we need to prioritize families. We need to understand that that resource is best directed towards preventing that separation from happening, strengthening the whole family unit and the community so that that care that is critical in a family can continue to be provided by the family of the child or by other families, so that the child gets the best of everything. They get the physical support, but they get the emotional and psychological support that takes place in a family. So it's so critical that we make that shift. We don't jump on those same assumptions that, you know, vulnerable children equals orphanages.
Yes, yes. And so what we're going to hear as we kind of work through this, and the other panelists here, is obviously defining the problem, which is residential, institutional, in the broadest sense of it. You've begun to explore and talk about family-based care. And as we talk with others on the panel, we're going to get a little bit more into what that might look like. One of the things that I wanted to have as a part of this panel was somebody with lived experience. And so Mohammed Nabu, I hope I said your name right, Mohammed. I believe you go by Nabs, am I right?
Yep.
So we're gonna pull Nabs in. Thank you, Rebecca. We're gonna come back to you here in some questions down the road a little bit. But if we could pull our next panelists up. Nabs, are you out there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, we're gonna get his video on here in just a second. You might have to click a button, I'm not sure. But to help us understand there you are, to help us understand potentially the new way of thinking, we have with us Nabs with Helping Children Worldwide. Nabs, would you share with us a little bit about the history of Helping Children Worldwide, and how you have helped transition the work of your organization to the kinds of things that Rebecca was talking about?
Definitely. Thank you for having me here, and I'm glad to be here. For a brief history, in the year 2000, Helping Children Worldwide built an orphanage to rescue children from the street, to rescue kids that were separated from families after the 11 years of civil war in Sierra Leone, my country of origin. That was initially a rescue mission, and that was all what was known and maybe needed at that time. But I was among the first set of children, about the first group of 40 children that was brought in. I was picked up from the street back then and taken to that orphanage after I got separated from my families for 11 years and I lost my dad during the war. So I grew up in that orphanage, went to college, came back, and became the director of that same orphanage. So HCW has been in existence for 20 years now. For 16 years, we were operating with the orphanage system because that was all we knew. But in 2016, 2017, as soon as I became the director of the orphanage, for a variety of reasons, including working with UNICEF, working with the government of Sierra Leone, we started advising ways to come up with a plan for transition. So HCW program director here on this side of the world in the US, and we are learning a lot from research about impacts of institutional care on children and all the aftermath when children leave institution. So we decided to transition the residential program to a family-based care. Because from the research, when we learned that 80 to 90% of children in orphanages have a living parent, we did our own research on every child who was ever in our own residential program. And our own rate was 98% of the children by then who were living in the orphanage. They were all having parents, 98% of them. So in addition to my own personal experience growing up in the orphanage and then coming back to lead that same orphanage, seeing the children in there and the experiences shared by other children that grew up with me in that same orphanage, as well as my day-to-day work with other orphanages within the same country in Sierra Leone, it was very clear to see how the children were desiring to connect with their families. It was clear to see how parents were sort of sneaking around to see their own children, to have access to their own children. They have to peek through the pigeonholes in order to get access to their children. And the workers within those orphanages, seeing them pushing the children away, that, hey, they are afraid of the partners. The partners are coming. They will know that you have parents, and then your support will cease. So we started asking a lot of questions. Why should this be happening? So we decided to do the transition process, because that was not supposed to happen. If we want to do child care, we want to do it right. These children are termed as orphans, and they have really a parent. And why are they choosing to stay in orphanage and instead of, staying with their parents? Why? So we decided to do, that's when we decided to do the transition process in order to move from orphanage care to family-based care. I will tell you a little bit about how we did it, how we went through the process later on.
So, and we're going to ask you a little bit about that, but we need to pause here just for a second and underline something. I mean, I hope everybody on this call is listening to what Nabs just said. I mean, we can, thank you, Nabs. I mean, but did you get the picture, folks, as he was describing that little children, the children that we have come in, that we love on, that we hold, that we have been sponsoring, are actually peeking through peepholes in the back of the fence, hoping to catch a glimpse of their parents. Did I catch you right?
Yep, that's correct.
And here's what I want to say. Us Christians, we do real good at guilt complexes. We can get ourselves all twisted up into guilt over all kinds of things. This is not the time to feel guilty for the unintended consequences of our well-intended hearts. So that's not what we're talking about here. So please, nobody on this webinar get worried about that. It made sense to us to do it this way. But as we start to unpack the non-intuitive side of this, and we start to see the reality of things like that, can we not begin to see maybe that's what you would do as a parent, if that was the best alternative for your child. But then the question comes, are we willing to step back from that now? I mean, I'm listening to you, Nabs, to talk about that a little bit. Tell us a little bit more about what would drive a parent to do that, and tell us a little bit more about the impact that has on children. But then I want you to quickly turn away from that and go to how different it is when our approach is more the way that you're doing it.
Oh, sure. Well, it is very evident that, the big why for parents to make a decision to put their children in orphanages in Sierra Leone, where I have lived and seen many, many orphanages there, and even around Asia, where there are other orphanages, I have people who work with those orphanages visited. It's like it's poverty. Poverty is the root cause, and it's a leading factor, poverty. And currently in Sierra Leone, the government was trying to make a decision, and some of the orphanage leaders there, as I'm still working with them, they are trying to make a decision during this COVID period, asking them, okay, now during this COVID period, we don't want to have the children stay in this close confinement, 100 children. So let them go home and stay there. Then after the COVID, they can come back. So the questions start coming, really? So if the children have homes to go to during crisis, so why are they in the orphanage in the first place? So those kind of questions start coming up. So extreme poverty continues to expand on other related problems, like separation of children from families, family breakdown, increase in number of children living on the street. It continues to be that leading factor behind the placement of children into alternative care programs. Yeah, for Sierra Leone, families give up their children because they are too poor to care for them, or they feel that it is the best way to help them to access basic services such as education, healthcare, and better food. So HCW saw this need. The dream was always to give the best care to children. We found out how to do this by not leaving the family and the community out of the equation, because we decided to do the reintegration and to do it successfully. so that the children do not end up running back to the orphanage. Because we learned that some of the orphanages tried to do something similar. They sent some children home. The children didn't stay. They came back to the orphanage. So because we learned that successful reintegration is very careful. It has to be, it's intentional. It is a careful, holistic, and intentional process. It is very important to adequately prepare both the families and the children. So that's what we did. It's emotional something. It's a big change, so it can be very emotional. This is a case-by-case basis as well, because all the children that are living in those orphanages, they have different history of trauma and family situation, and they have been in the orphanage for different length of time. So we did the pre-reintegration work that involves deliberate family tracing, where we trace every child's family. Then we did the mid-reintegration work itself, which involves family preparation. We prepare the family assessment, the readiness, the bonding opportunity, connection opportunities with their children, home assessment, and then we did the actual reintegration, which is the reunion phase, followed by the post-reintegration work. You know, we supported that with strong case management support, family strengthening or empowerment strategies, like attachment workshops, like empowerment, like adult literacy, microfinance programs, education, or specific to a family, because you want to make sure these children do not run back to their family. So we have to undergo all of these things just to make sure it is very safe, it is successful, and it is intentional. Because the end goal should be to have these families become self-sufficient. And this happens as we shift from coaching the problem to empowering the people, because we need, poverty is the main cause. Taking one child from the family and bringing them in the orphanage, that can help the one child. It's great. I benefited from that. I'm very grateful today, because if I can speak today a little bit of English that you all can hear me, because the orphanage sent me to school. But I'm coming from an extended family, and there I have over 600 children that never got the opportunity, because during the war, the orphanages can only have requirement. They can take only one child or two children from a family of 6,
Right.
and then put that 2 children in the orphanage to give them money support them for 10 years. And then the rest of the family stays in poverty. Yeah. My family up to date still struggle with that. They are still very poor. I lost my language, and other children also lost their language, and they could not even speak the native languages, because we are all being trained to impress the visitors who are coming to visit us for 2 weeks, so that we can speak their language and we can be in their culture, and we can lose the culture of that. So there are a lot of good things about living in the orphanage, and there are also downsides that are really, really internal. We have those identity questions. Who are we? Where do I come from? Do I matter in society? Where is my voice? Am I connected? All those identity questions that are much deeper, like the iceberg. Orphanage addresses the surface of the iceberg. The orphanage is not able to address what is underneath the water, what is underneath the iceberg. That is not there. So we decided to move from coaching the problem to empowering the people, as we shift from we always being the experts with the solutions to the people being the experts to bring solutions to their own problem, because they know their own lives better than we do. They do know that. So we decided to continue moving from individual child focus only to family level, to family based and community based, wherein we can stop telling ideas to asking them that they can come up with a solution. What do you have to make this situation better? What can we do? You don't have to choose between orphanage and food, or orphanage and education, or orphanage and healthcare. We really want to help you for sure. You can still stay with your mom, your poor mom, your single mom, and we can equip your family so that you can become self-sufficient. You don't have to always ask something from us, and your mother can be able to show that genuine love for you, as from a mother to a child. So that's, I can stop there for now.
Nabs, I mean, I would play your part back over and over and over again for the American church to hear. I mean, all of this, our learning over the past 20 years or so around asset-based community development, around strength-based, I call it the calculus of compassion, is that We can no longer treat compassion as you have a need, I have some resources, I'm going to meet your need, you tell me thank you, and I go home. We talk with the American church about the unfortunate reality that we have elevated a positive volunteer experience or a positive donor experience as the most important thing in our mission work. And the only way for us to get to the point where we can see the logic of the kinds of things that you're talking about is if we will back off from that. I call it a benevolent narcissism sometimes, that we're so interested in that positive volunteer. And we all understand why that's important. We understand why those children have to learn English, because there's a revenue stream that comes from that. I mean, we're just being honest here. And as we begin to be honest about the economics of how things are exchanged that way, and we begin to be honest about trauma and stress and those kinds of things that we're putting on children unintentionally, maybe we can step back a little bit and start to say, there's got to be a better way, and it becomes more logical. I got to get this real quick. Give me a quick answer to this. Did you lose some funding because you made this pivot, because you went this other direction? How did the funding side go as you made this change from American churches?
Yeah, I mean, that's another thing. We are blessed with really God-hearted donors and sponsors, partners who are really kind of committed. We explained to them, they kind of understood the concept. So we didn't really lose funding. You know, in fact, we started getting more opportunities for more funding. We got more funding opportunities. So funding didn't shrink. There are people on the fence who are trying to decide, okay, now I'm going to lose this privilege of going over to play with this one child in the orphanage for 2 weeks, but my passion is maybe dropping. So we kind of continue to encourage people to be able to elevate their passion and continue to stay engaged in this, because we found out that this is not only about rescuing a child, but now it's about rescuing the child and stabilizing the child and tracing the family of that child and preparing the child and then bringing them together so that they can live together, so that your money, your $2 you give, is now going to be more impact. Because when we did our own survey, it was costing more to even take care of one child living in the orphanage than to take care of a whole family living together. So your $5 you can donate can make a wider impact now, and you can see that. So people started seeing that level of intentionality behind it. So we didn't lose donors anyway. But some were hard to talk to, but later on they came on board anyways. But they all meant well, because those people meant well. Some of them didn't know anyway, genuinely. So knowing this is about, we all want the best for children. We know what we are doing. Is the how part we wanted to tweak a little bit. We all know what we are doing. We are taking care of children. But how do we take care of children? How do we make it even better? That was only the how part we needed to change, so that these children can move from where they are to really experience those wow lives they are meant to live. That is it. So sponsors were able to wrap their minds around that concept. It took a little bit of time to explain that, but eventually they came on board. So I'm very grateful for, people who are kind of ready to adopt certain changes anyways.
Well, and I don't know who those donors are. I wish I did. We'd stand up and give them a standing ovation right now. Yay for you for having the courage to kind of pivot in these ways and to support somebody with lived experience who's saying to us, there's a better way. God, raise up many, many more people like that. So we're kind of going into a little bit of the idea of transitioning and change. You just gave us a little bit of an idea about what it took to pivot your organization as an actual partner on the ground. Ellie, Rebecca, I'm going to jump to Ellie here in just a second, but I want you to give us a little background of some of the work that you've done to move some churches in Australia towards this. I mean, what have you done to get the local church in Australia? And then I want to jump over to Ellie. We're getting to you, Ellie. Here we come. Rebecca.
Yeah, so we introduced this into the Australian Christian Churches Church Network, which is one of the largest sort of denominations or movements in Australia, back in probably 2010. And I worked for the Missions and Development Agency of the Australian Christian Churches movement, and we decided to make that pivot away from funding and running and supporting institutional care in a number of countries through our missionaries and partners, to promoting and working in family-based care. And And so we had to introduce it to the church, who were the primary supporters and funders of these missionaries and these field workers and partners who were running institutions in different countries. So it had to go in tandem. And we started by, sort of giving all the background and the evidence and talking about why, and introducing people to the fact that most of these kids were not actually orphans as they had assumed that they were. Most had families, understanding what the real drivers are, all the things that Naps has explained. And, people had different reactions. Some people immediately went, oh my gosh, this is so obvious. How come I didn't see this before? And they immediately shifted. Others, particularly people who had more of an emotional investment in particular, institutions or orphanages that they'd been visiting a lot, or maybe had been part of founding, found it a lot more difficult and, needed a lot more opportunity for conversation and a lot more sort of guiding through different concerns. So their concerns were more about, what about this? But what about this? But what about this? But what about that particular child that I know? I've seen these communities. What's going to happen if they go home? So it's working through all those concerns. And so it really was a process of shifting the mindset, because it is so ingrained in us. We've grown up in churches that associate, children overseas with orphanages. That is just, they go hand in glove. And we had to unravel those assumptions. We had to unravel all of that thinking. We had to change those mindsets, and that's hard work. It took, a number of years of just constant campaigning and awareness raising, and I was on the phone for hours every day with different pastors and leaders, and we had to take it through all the tiers of leadership in the whole movement, and working with different leaders and thought leaders and different parts of the faith community to get this through. We had to really work hard alongside of the institutions that they supported to walk them through the transition, provide all that technical support so they could see how it could work and see that these kids would actually be better in these families. And then we had to share those positive stories to say, this is working, this is not theory, this works in practice. We had to create a whole new theological framework around this as a part of supporting this concept that actually God says he puts the lonely in a family. God's idea is family. God's design is family. Our notion of orphanage is something we have constructed over time and misconstrued over time. And we need to really go back and see what the Bible says when it's commanding us to care for vulnerable people. It is not asking us to remove them from families. It's asking us to protect vulnerable family units that are at risk of having their rights violated. So we had to do all of that background work to help the church really move forward with this new idea and this thinking. And it was, there was a lot of tense moments in there. There was a lot of criticism. There was some people who went, this, yay, we've been thinking about this. There was others who went, oh my gosh, this makes sense. And there were others that were like angry and mad at me personally, mad at our agency for driving these changes. There was a lot of fear. And so it takes time. You have to create a lot of space for people to ask questions and journey with people to make these changes. And then when we started coming out the other end, people who may have started off as saying, absolutely not, no, this is bad, or no, you're taking God out of missions. People would see it and they would see whole families, getting an opportunity to hear the gospel because social workers were going into communities. They would see, churches being planted in communities that were fostering children, like all manner of different things happening where they realized, okay, this is actually good from every angle, this is good. And then they were able to start to celebrate it from that point on. So mixed reactions, a stack of work, lots of intense support. And then, people were really able to celebrate it.
But the good news is it can happen.
It can happen.
It can happen. Yes, indeed. And Ellie, I want to turn to you with us. There's Ellie Oswald, the executive director of Faith to Action Initiative, in large part, big part of this. So I want everybody to know that Faith to Action helped me actually script this thing, and this is good leadership there. They wanted you to hear everything that you've heard up to this point, kind of laying the foundation for some of the things. A great organization, really, really working with the American church to kind of move into this space that you've just heard Rebecca talking about. So Ellie, with Australia leading the way in these changes, we have a lot of work to do here in American churches to better respond to our call to care for the orphans. And Faith to Action exists to support that very thing. So where do we have to go as the American Christians, the American church? What kind of shifts do we need to be making, Ellie?
Well, First, I want to just recognize something that Nab said, that he just said it real quick, but they found the donors mean well. And I think that has been our experience. I've both been a pastor and I've also worked with a lot of churches and a lot of Christians on this issue. And it's a beautiful space to live in because people do mean well. They care about kids, and that's why they're doing this. And I think that's a really important place to start. And I can probably empathize with some on this webinar. I started working for World Vision International's technical team. I'd actually studied vulnerable children at Fuller, wherever I went, Fuller Seminary. And I was struck with all this research in the position I had there. I was researching and learning about care for children. And what I learned blew my mind. I couldn't understand why I was raised in a church that celebrated missions work. I participated in missions programs. I studied missions in graduate school, and that this had never been obvious to me. And this is that we've created a problem. Through generosity and sacrifice, we've built and supported and visited orphanages in response to disasters, HIV and AIDS and Ebola and all of these things that now draw kids into families who are struggling with, draw kids from families who are struggling with poverty or a disability or other challenges. So instead of responding to those problems, we're actually creating the potential trauma of separation, as Rebecca described. And I just, how could I not know? And it's just become so obvious to me that we do need to take some time to correct the problem that we actually were trying to solve. And I think God's funny, because eventually I ended up as a pastor and was placed in a situation, a pastor in a church here in Seattle, and was placed in a situation of looking at programs that were supporting residential care. And what's been really great is now stepping into Faith to Action. I get to work with churches every single day. And what I found both in my work with the congregation in Seattle and with my work with pastors is that when people know better, they want to do better. And so with my own church, I spent 5 years learning and listening alongside lay leaders, reading books together, putting strategies together to ensure that we were doing what we can. We could do the best possible work, and we still knew we had gaps. We struggled with our Savior complex, struggled so much, but we were working together as a congregation to do better. And that encourages me. Of course, there's pushback. Of course, there's guilt that we don't want to feel. But there's also people who are really excited about doing better. And there's people who can help you. So yes, the U.S. Church has contributed to creating a problem. Let's be real. Let's put it out there. Tom, you told us to be real. But also, it wasn't a problem we intended to do. It's actually the opposite of what we intended to do. And yes, also the U.S. Church has to and can play a really significant role in changing the situation and ensuring that kids are cared for in families. And I just say there's two things that Faith to Action has prioritized. One is changing the paradigm. I don't know if you guys have experienced this on the webinar, but this is a paradigm shift. And it's an important one, because there is assumption in the U.S. church missions world that orphan equals orphanage. That is the answer. And when you think about even the term orphan, even though it's misused, what's the opposite of an orphan? It's a child in a family. So we want to shift that perspective to from the answer being an orphanage to the answer being a family, and then figure out how to do that. But that paradigm shift is really helpful. So when I talk to people, I sometimes talk to students. I tend to do one right before Thanksgiving, and I always say, you know, go talk to Aunt Sally at the Thanksgiving table about this, because what she thinks is important. Our cultural norms and assumptions are a kind of fueling this, this system, this funnel of support towards a mechanism or model of care that actually isn't best for kids and isn't showing the long-term results of transformation that we all so want to see. We want to see that for kids. And so changing the paradigm, having those, I invite everybody after this webinar to go talk to somebody about it, to read some things and invite other people to think about it. So we need to shift the paradigm. And the second thing is we can change our practice. And so that is hard work. And NAB's talked about, if you're funding or running an orphanage right now, and you want to think about what does this mean for what you're doing, it isn't a simple process, but there are many people who've done this before. There is resource, there is guidance. Reach out to Faith to Action. We can help you connect with these wonderful people who have done it before, and resources that are created. And if you're not doing that, think about what kind of things you are supporting through your funding, through missionaries, through sponsored children, and think critically about that. Are these the things I'm supporting? Are they supporting families so that they can do their best to care for children? Are they supporting communities where when a family hits a crisis, that they'll have the safety nets and the care they need to get through that crisis without having to give their child away, essentially? And if you're able to invest in those things, you're making a real change, and you can be excited about what you're doing. I think it's really important to say we are not talking about ending anything. We're not talking about ending anything. I've said it's about how we're doing it. Let's continue to care for vulnerable children. We have to, but we're going to find the best ways possible to do that. And that means ensuring that they not only get that top of the iceberg, their food and their shelter and their kind of basic material needs met, but that the iceberg underneath the water, their need for belonging and identity and security and all those things are so important for our long-term success, are met also by being in a safe, loving family.
Thanks.
Sorry,
and one of the things, what's that?
I get excited.
Well, I can tell. And one of the things that I asked if it was at all possible was, would we be able to pull in somebody from the clergy? Because we're not here just to point a finger saying we're doing it wrong. And I hope that those of you on this webinar see that we're getting practitioners who have been out there on the front end of this, that have been out there working this for quite a while, who have some success stories. And so we want you to understand it can be done. It can be done if you are a partner, an indigenous partner out there. You can pivot your organization this way. Mm-hmm. If you're a US-based organization, you can pivot your ways in this way. And one of the most difficult things for us to find oftentimes, though, is somebody from the pastorate or mission pastors who have kind of stayed with this within a local church long enough, who can talk about that transition as well. And Ella, you brought a pastor to join us today. You want to introduce Pastor Dan Hammer?
Yes,
Ellie?
Dan, there you are. Dan,
welcome, Dan.
And the work of Overlake Church has been an encouragement to Faith to Action and myself for a long time. They have a commitment to caring for vulnerable children around the world and have been willing to pivot when they learn new things and find new ways to serve. So I'm super excited to hear Dan share.
Thank you. Appreciate the chance to share on one of my favorite topics. I'm with Overlake Christian Church in Redmond, Washington, and the church has been around over 50 years, has a rich history of missions work and supporting various organizations and programs over the years. I came here about 11 years ago, and I came with a passion for street children, partly through some personal experiences of mine. So I spent a lot of time with ideas of how to help street children. I was overwhelmed by the number of kids that live on the streets throughout the world, and it's a U.S. problem too. We're not just talking in developing countries. It's a problem in every community of any size. So we studied, looked in a lot of different programs. I had a lot of dumb ideas. I had a lot of false starts trying to understand what it was that we could do, how we could engage the local churches to be a part of the solution. and I wasn't really getting too far in anything until I met an organization called Agape Children's Ministry. They were working in Kisumu, Kenya, and they had been around for 20 some years, or 15 years at the time. This was 11 years ago. And they were helping street kids. They had a feeding program. They basically created an orphanage because it was designed for 50 kids. They ended up with 150 kids in there because that's the way it works with orphanages. And they were doing the best they could with these kids, but when they all got old enough, they had to shoo them out the gates because they didn't have much for them. And they tried some training programs, and that with minimal success, and it was just a very difficult concept to find success. And so I challenged them of, hey, why don't we work with the local churches? There are lots of churches in Kisumu. Why can't we engage them in the work that you're doing? And I also challenged them with the idea of, in each of those churches, there are lots of families, and there are a lot of families that probably would be willing to help you out with these kids. What I didn't expect is that so many of those kids, and I've seen various statistics, but I think the accepted ones, but 80% of the kids in institutional care have family. So Agape started this process of reintegrating children back into their families. And in some cases, it was their family of origin. In some cases, it was extended family with an aunt or uncle, grandparent. But they were having incredible success in clearing out the orphanage and placing these kids back in families, even after they'd been in the orphanage institutional setting for a pretty long period of time. Where I was just blown away by the success of what was happening there. And we were doing a lot of work in the community with the pastors and some water projects, various things in the community, agricultural training, some other things, trying to just create an environment where kids could return home. But it was very difficult to engage the local church. It was a challenge for us, partly because the organization had been around so long and had done it without the need for the church, and partly the organization, they were having success and really didn't see the need for the local church to be engaged. So when it came down to it, there was a city that we'd been working in for over 15 or 16 years on the other side of Kenya. And I talked to them about if we could replicate their program in a second city. We knew we were able to reintegrate children. And when I say reintegrate children, I always try and use the term responsible reintegration. You can reintegrate children into a dangerous situation. You can reintegrate children without giving the preparation to the family that's receiving them. You can reintegrate children who aren't at all ready to go home or go live in a family situation. So and you can reintegrate them without doing sufficient follow-up to make sure that they remain safe and that they are in a good situation. So Agape's done an incredible job of creating a process of responsible reintegration. So I knew that we could reintegrate children. I wanted to see if we could reintegrate children using the local church as a partner. So we opened up, what we did was that we talked to our local church about, would you be willing, our congregation, would you be willing to be a part of this new model? Because, we have supported a lot of different orphanages, all kinds of programs throughout the years. There's always a little bit of sensitivity to, we've done it this way for such a long time. Why are we putting this much resource into that? No one ever helped that much with this program. But they were, again, your traditional model and I try never to criticize the traditional model. And it was well-meaning people doing the best they could with what they knew. The approach that we've always taken is we know a model that's very effective and accomplishes the things that we would see are the most valuable in this process. So we would like to see you look at this model and get behind it. So I was fortunate enough that our pastor did a 7-week series on Nehemiah, and every week we pushed this, we called it the Katali Project, or the expansion of Katali. And we did training sessions for anyone that would come to help them understand God's plan for children to be in families and not in institutions, and just kind of awakening in people the concept that there are some things that are lacking when you come through an institution. And we're hoping to be able to close that gap in this kind of a responsible reintegration model. So we opened up, and that's a city that I've been working in for 15 years and had so few success stories. And mostly I know street children who have died because that's just what happens to most street kids in Katali, or did happen. We opened up 2 years ago, and already we've had over 350 children successfully reintegrated off the streets and back into their families with an entire program of follow-up and things like that. So where I haven't been as successful as I like is to see as much local church engagement as I would like. When we reintegrate a child into a community, we have a social worker that goes out and checks on those kids on a regular basis until they're 18. Those children are all being reintegrated into a community that has a church. We have a great relationship with a seminary in the area that's trained most of the pastors in that side of Africa, or that side of Kenya. So we're working hard to try and do a better handoff of those children to the community leaders and the pastors, as opposed to relying on the organization to be responsible for the follow-up. It's like here in America, a social worker can go out to a house once a month and have no idea what's going on. It's the same thing in Kenya. You send a social worker out once a month, it may look like everything's okay. But if you live in the community, if you're a neighbor, if you walk past that house every day, you truly know what's going on, and if that child is in the right environment and getting what he needs to succeed. So that was the transformation that our church made, was to start understanding the importance of responsible reintegration, and that there was a time and place for some of the previous programs that we'd had, but we have tried our best to focus on what we've found to be a model of huge success.
So Dan, I wish we had more time. Maybe down the road we'll do a webinar with pastors in particular, and I'm going to call it "Dumb Ideas and False Starts." I think that's what I think we as pastors need to free ourselves up a little bit, the clergy, to try some things to get to a different outcome. So I salute you for doing that. I'd love to. We don't have time, but I'd love to pick your brain at the actual change and what happened and how people came along. But it seems obvious to me that through the intentionality of it all, that people could begin to see the results, and it's really hard to argue with results.
Right. But if we're going to replicate it to the degree that it needs to be replicated, it can't be American churches funding NGOs in the developing world. It has to be the local church taking responsibility, and the American churches providing resources and training, but not, those organizations can't be dependent on Americans, because no matter how good our hearts are, the developing world is littered with programs that started and ran out of money and left
and there we are back again to the whole idea of asset-based community development, even to the point of the indigenous church. It's not about an American church being a hero in Sierra Leone. It's about how does the American church help the churches of Sierra Leone be the heroes in their own community.
Right. And that's where we focused our time on training pastors, and not just in some of the typical ways. I'm a big believer in trauma-informed care. And I think when you start to understand trauma and the impact of trauma, you have a much higher chance of success in dealing with an individual. So we've done a lot of trauma training for pastors, for leaders, for social workers. I think that's a game changer in the caring community.
Thank you. So we're kind of on the last lap here. Want to get in a few more questions and then give some time just for you folks to give us some kind of closing thoughts. But Ellie, I want to turn our attention for just a second, maybe to you and Rebecca, for just a minute anyhow, to the whole idea of short-term mission trips. And a huge part of the way the North American Church oftentimes does stuff, because it's an easy in for all kinds of volunteers, all the way down to junior high and stuff like that. Tell us a little something about the risks and the harms to children in orphanages that are associated with our typical short-term mission trip. Ellie, start us off.
Okay. Yeah, of course, short-term missions are a major way that we in the U.S. Church engage with support for vulnerable children. And not only that, but they are a major way to get your church to engage. As Dan mentioned, some of the hardest work is ensuring that your congregation is excited about your missions, your global missions work. So they're really important. And I think, with COVID-19, probably most of us have canceled trips. And I think it is a helpful time to kind of stop and to consider what we're doing. We can all do better, but I think especially around this issue of mission trips that can support vulnerable children, this could be a time for us to do better. So we've worked with Faith Actions Coalition, so we're always working with partners. It's not, Ellie's ideas. This is our partners that work around the world, both in short-term missions specifically, but those who are hosting missions, people who have different opinions. But we've come up with 4 risks that really people need to consider when we think about visiting orphanages and engaging with children in orphanages. So I'll just quickly share them if that's okay. One is that visiting an orphanage can potentially cause further harm to attachment. Rebecca mentioned attachment is one of the challenges. It's this idea of the bond between a child and their primary caregiver. It's incredible. If you don't know about attachment, it's incredibly important for the development of a child for the long term. And so coming in, visiting, connecting, bonding with a child, connecting, and then leaving is felt much deeper for a child who's struggling with their own attachment issues, who, because they're in the orphanage, we already know have suffered some sort of trauma because they're currently living separated from their family. And so they're particularly vulnerable to kind of exasperating the experience of attachment and the different attachment challenges. And then you think of it, if you're coming in engaging with a child for a week or 2 weeks or 3 months, and then another group's coming in a week here, a week there, that cycle just continues and can really be deeply felt by these children and can cause further attachment trauma. So whenever you go into an orphanage, if you have before, you might have experienced, this really strong, immediate affection and attachment and connection between a child, maybe grabbing your leg or wanting to be held. That in the child protection world is an absolute red flag. We know, those of us who have children or have spent time with children, that's not normal behavior. A healthy, well-attached child is not going to run to a stranger and call them mommy or daddy, or some of those things that we know they're not normal. And so it's a huge red flag, and we know that short-term missions can contribute to that. The other one is recognizing that short-term mission trips to orphanages expose children and can affect the protection of those children, because not only is that child now exposed to people with great intentions who want to love them and care for them, but it's also open to people who don't have that great of intentions. And we see terrible, sad stories all the time about children who are abused and hurt by people who are coming in to volunteer in the orphanages. It's not something I want to talk about the church about. Everyone will say, well, that's not me, that's not my church, but it's happening. And we need to take responsibility for it. And we need to know just by going that we also are participating in a system which would allow a child to be less safe. So sorry, I'm saying it. And the third thing is that the experience of a child in an orphanage and a visitor coming in and out can lead to this sense of being objectified, or can bring stigma on that child in their community. I have a friend, Stephen Usembe, who's incredible and has taught me so much. But he talks about his experience growing up in an orphanage pretty publicly, and how, he felt like he was labeled something. He actually was labeled an orphan. He felt like, even though he had a father, and the goal of being labeled an orphan was so the visitors and so the donors would, feel sorry and give their money. And he talks about kind of being like, he felt like he was in a zoo as people came through, something to be viewed, not who he really was. And I think we have to recognize, we probably see this in mission trips we've all taken. I know I've been in situations where maybe you're learning about a program and one of the volunteers says, oh, meet Jimmy, and Jimmy, tell us about when this terrible thing happened in your life. Or they'll talk in front of the whole group and say, this happened to Jimmy. And oh my goodness, I don't think anybody's intending to do harm, but children aren't that naive, They can understand what's going on in those situations probably much better than us visitors. And they feel that pity, that otherness, that objectification. I think we need to recognize when we're going to visit an orphanage and volunteer in an orphanage for a week and post pictures, we aren't treating children like humans, like we're treating them like objects. Like there's an otherness there. And I think, again, it's not easy to say, but we have to recognize it in ourselves. And I've been thinking about this and studying this, and I still do it every single day. And then the final thing, which I think is maybe the most important, so if you tuned out, tune back in, is that as people are coming into work in an orphanage, to volunteer in an orphanage, it is bringing a level of support that you might not even realize. Sometimes you're giving money, and that's kind of obvious support, but you're also bringing clout to that organization amongst its community. When you have Westerners coming in and out of your orphanage, you're legit in that community, and you're bringing your resources, your support to a model that right now we're not sure is serving every child well. And so recognizing that short-term missions can provide, kind of even prop up a model for care that perhaps isn't best for kids. And we've seen this happen. Many of us who've been working to see the kids go into families that can go into families and into alternative families like foster care or kinship care. We've seen short-term missions come in as this new player. Like all of a sudden we were making progress. Countries are making progress, seeing kids come home, policies changing. And then there's this pretty big influential piece of visitors coming in and providing support and advocacy and funding around a model for care that was really kind of phasing out. So you can plan your trip to an orphanage in a way that allows you to make sure kids are safe and make sure that you're not affecting their attachment, and even you can try not to bring objectification, but at the end of the day, they're still bringing support for a certain model and approach to caring for children. And I think that's really important to keep in mind in this conversation.
Thanks. So I think what I want to do, we've got about 15 minutes, and I think we're going to be able to get all of the questions in here. I want to jump to both Rebecca and Nabs a little bit, maybe to go to the kind of the solution side of this, and then bring you back as well, Ellie, to talk a little bit. But Rebecca, you've walked with Australian churches through this transition, and they've made some pretty significant sweeping changes, even laws, from what I understand, to guide how people care for orphans. What would you have to say about how we might shape these kinds of trips differently in positive ways to overcome the risks that Ellie was just describing?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, yes, in Australia, we have pursued multiple routes where we've done a lot of awareness raising and work with the church around redesigning what mission trips are and look like. And I'll speak a little bit to the framework we use with that. But we've also pursued the route with government of, you know, of legislation and regulation that impacts the charity sector, including the church, recognizing that just in some countries and to some extent, this is actually it's tipping into criminal territory, not the missions trips and the churches going, but the behavior that's happening on the field with, you know, missions trips driving the recruitment of children out of communities and families and into institutions where they're actually being exploited, where they're actually being held in situations that, you know, being deprived of food, being malnourished, so that they can elicit the sympathy of volunteers and visitors who come and then give more money. And so, but because we're seeing in some cases it to such an extreme, we have pursued more regulatory sort of mechanisms in Australia to bring balance to this. But, you know, in terms of how do we shift this into the short-term missions, I think one of the critical things is to shift the lens of how are we looking at this? How are we designing a missions trip? Who's at the center of that design process? Is it our church and our team and the experience we're trying to create for them? Or is it the community, including the children, that we are, you know, trying to support and assist throughout all of our missions work, including short-term missions? And, you know, this concept is called looking at ethics from the margins. We have to not just only ask the question of, is it good for me as a church, as a pastor, as a missions team member? Is it good for the person in the equation who has the least amount of power, who is, you know, is the most vulnerable? And often that's these children and these vulnerable families who don't have as much opportunity to shape the conversation with us. And so we have to shift it to think about what is ethical for them, what is good for them, and ask ourselves some hard questions. Things like, you know, if I'm going to go over there and I'm looking at going into an orphanage or providing care for children, we have to actually ask ourselves, would I be permitted to do that in my own country with my level of skills, with my level of experience, with my level of training, and with the time I'm actually able to invest in this, a week or 2 weeks, would I be permitted to do that in Australia and go into a residential care unit with very vulnerable children who've experienced severe trauma and say, I'm just here to take over and provide care for them for a week? The answer is I probably wouldn't. And if the answer is that I wouldn't in my own country, then I have to ask myself, why is that okay for me to do that to somebody else's child, in somebody else's community, if it's not appropriate for me to do here? And reverse that question one more time and ask ourselves, if somebody else was to come into my home, my community, my country, with the amount of experience, training, and you know, and qualifications that I possess, would I be willing for them to do that to my child, to take on that role in my child's life? Would I be willing to have them come and do that in my family, or would I be uncomfortable with that? And if the answer is I'm uncomfortable with that, then we again have to ask, why is it okay if we're doing that overseas? So we have to start shifting the decision-making framework we use in determining what is appropriate in short-term missions, to think about how it's impacting people who are on the margins with the least amount of power in this equation. And if it's not in their best interest, then it shouldn't be happening in our missions program. So it's really shifting that framework of thinking so that when we're making the decisions, it's not based upon creating experiences and opportunities for our teams. It is based upon what is actually in the best interest of these communities and those families. And that's going to change what we do. It's going to change the types of roles that we play. It doesn't change that there is a role for short-term missions, but it will dramatically alter what that looks like. And it's most likely going to mean it's more of a supporting role or a learning role, so that we go over and we learn, we understand better, so we come back to our home countries and communities and we can advocate better and we can raise awareness better, and then we can better support those organizations and communities overseas. So that shift in thinking to me is really critical.
Thanks, Rebecca. Nabs, I've been told that Helping Children Worldwide has made some significant changes to their short-term mission trips to ensure that some of these best practices apply. Tell us a little bit about the changes you guys have made.
Oh, sure. Again, that was just part of the process of reintegration. As we said, it has to be very intentional, and it's not only taking children from the orphanage and taking them home or thinking about sending children home, but there is one to think about sending children home, then you have to also think about what next, what happens next, what happens to short-term mission, what happens to the buildings, what happens to the staff. You know, all those questions have to come in place. So before we did the transition, we kind of already thought of, okay, we got some ideas, how we're going to reposition, restructure our short-term missions. because we are kind of moving away from just being a short-term mission. You go to the Sierra Leone, you go to the orphanage and just see the children for 2 weeks and you come back, mission is over. But how can you continue to do this mission even when you're back, wherever you're coming from? So HSW made some changes to short-term mission throughout this process. One of the changes we do, we kind of, before even the change, as we're about to make the change, or we're already making the change, we would dramatically reduce access missioners had to children in the residence before the transition. Because as Ellie was sharing, sometimes when missioners used to go, I was living in the orphanage at least, when missioners used to go there, they would spend 2 weeks and then we'll form all this bonding with them. And we'll forget about the staff, like the country staff we are working in there. And sometimes whenever those missionaries we are leaving, there will be a lot of emotions and crying and all over the place. So the children will be sad for almost like 2 weeks because of the way they came, they were putting us on their laps, on their shoulders. And of course, these are things we all have learned along the way, that some of those things are not really appropriate in some other countries. Like in the US, you don't just take a child and put them on your lap. But like when they go to these orphanages, some of those things are happening. Again, maybe those were genuine mistakes. And part of the process is to know better, and try to do better. So we did that shift. And also we started to focus mission projects on building capacity in the local staff versus direct programming for children, because this is about sustainability. We want to make sure that the best way to care for the children is not to leave the family, the staff, or the community outside of that equation. So we try to focus missionary to say, hey, when you go on mission, you're not only going to be confined in this small wall, the fence. Now you're going to take the mission really out of this small environment, this small confinement, to the homes of where these children live, to the actual community, and work with the staff who can in return be able to better care for the children. So it's not only caring directly for the children now, organizing VBS for 2 weeks for only the children, but now what skills do you have? You are a medical doctor from here. You have the experience, you are a teacher. So we organize a lot of projects like we call Teachers Learning Collaborative, wherein US teachers can go over and work with the Sierra Leone teachers and collaborate together, share ideas, share best practices and teaching. And then they can in turn use those skills and continue to improve their teaching skills. So we kind of changed that, and it has been working very, very well. That's one way we change the focus. Also, we now ask the local partners to determine the projects that they need or they want, and they tell us versus having the missioners to like the expertise to drive their own creation of specific project to bring them, okay, this is what you want. We found that the best people to be in this position to sit with them, we have what to call the Village Partnership Initiative, where people go from this place, they go sit to the community together with our local partners in Sierra Leone. They meet with them, they work with the village community, and they exchange ideas. We don't have well. We really need well. We are drinking from the river and we're all getting typhoid. We don't have a clinic. We do not have better toilet facilities. So they work with them and really come up with these needs that are really going to make that community become sustainable. And then they partner with them for their own success, which is very, very much meaningful. And that one has been happening, which is so much useful to both the community, the children in that community, the families of that community, as well as the partners who are coming to make that wider impact instead of just focusing on one child. So it was the idea of taking the mission out of close confinement within the orphanage to the community, because for children to be effective and long-lived, for childcare to be effective and long-lived, as you say, we have to make sure the families and the communities are not taken out of the picture. They have to be there. But for impact on our church partners, though, there are those who still struggle letting go of the old mission tree model. That is evident. That is true. But those that are really, really engaged in serving and in mission are still engaged in a much more collaborative and relationship building way, which is so much meaningful. So yes, we redirected the focus, and missioners are now able to not only focus on the child, but be able to take that mission work out of the orphanage into the community where they can make a wider impact. And the impact, it's really, really sustainable and it's meaningful.
Thank you. Yeah. Ellie, thoughts? Something to add to that?
I mean, it's simple. Find partners who are strengthening families and communities. so that they can take care well for kids. And we could talk for another hour on short-term missions. I mean, there are resources. Faith to Action has one. There's a couple others that are great, even if you want ideas. But I would just encourage people to let's be creative in finding ways to still care for these kids, to ensure that our mission trips are supporting vulnerable children, but do it in ways that are strengthening their families and the communities that are supporting families.
Thank you. Folks, we're getting right to the end here of this, and I want to give some next steps for everybody as we kind of sign off. But let me say a couple things. I would say that no organization is more consistently present among the poor and vulnerable around the world than the church. Nobody would disagree with that statement. Now more than ever is an opportunity for the church to demonstrate its heart for the poor and its commitment to the people and organizations on the front line. And God has blessed the American church with resources beyond imagination. And again, to quote our friends at Poverty Cure, it's not enough to have a heart for the poor, we must also have a head for the poor. And what you've just heard and seen are some pretty impressive people who have both in this webinar. And so I want to give you a few things that I think Megan's going to put some stuff up there in the, somewhere on this, on your chat site or something, there should be some links to Faith to Action. If you've got some questions for any of these people, if you follow that link, you can go and ask some questions of any one of these. Also, Ellie, there's a Global Church Challenge, am I right? Tell us about the Global Church Challenge and what that's all about.
So if you think we're the only 4 people in the world that are excited about family-based care, you're wrong. What's really exciting is slowly over the past 2 decades, churches and Christians all over the world are waking up to the importance of family-based care. And there's truly, in the last 2 or 3 years, we've truly felt like we can call it a movement. So there's truly a movement of Christians who are working to see children cared for in safe and loving families, and doing that in a variety of ways. The Global Church Pledge is kind of a recent development out of that movement. It's simply a way to recognize a decision to join this movement, essentially. And it's super simple. I'll just read it quickly. It's 2 sentences. We believe God designed families as the best environment for children and young people to receive the love, belonging, and protection they need in order to flourish. Therefore, on behalf of vulnerable children around the world, we commit to support efforts which strengthen families, invest in family-based solutions, and combat the root causes of their vulnerability. And that is it. And some of you today might be ready to say, yeah, that's exactly where I'm at. That's what I want to be a part of. So I invite you to sign that pledge. I think Megan did add it into our chat. I saw it come up. And there are probably some of you that are confused and have questions and concerns. And that is good and okay and right, probably. And Faith to Action wants to be a resource. We don't run programs. We don't fund programs. We relatively neutral space. So if you want to reach out just to know what is happening in this movement, what is the research, what tools and guidance are out there, we'd love to do that if you're not ready to sign this commitment. But if you are, come join the movement. The train has left the station. Change is happening. And I think God is glorified in some of the beautiful, beautiful stories of children and families being transformed.
Thank you. Thank you so much to all of these. Let me, I want to say something quick. I hope that if you have found this valuable, that you will, that you'll join us for the next couple of webinars that we have scheduled. I'm going to bring something up on my screen right now. So Megan, I hope you will put in the, there we go, that if you can put in there the sharing the screen that I'm on. So I just would invite all of the attendees on this to jump out to our website, significantmatters.com, And if you look here under services, under webinars, you click on that and it'll take you real quick to this whole series of Voices from the Front Line. There you've just seen this one. Next week on the 31st, we're going to be looking at how the American church can serve the poor through enterprise solutions. So we've been talking, NAB said it and so did others, that the underlying issue is poverty. And so we've had different presenters at our SAT talks that are going to be presenting what they're doing around the world and just helping the church wrestle with what that looks like. And then bringing it a little closer to home on August 13th, we're going to talk with a couple of folks that are involved with the same kind of asset-based community development. How do you help people break the cycle of poverty? James Whitford out of Watered Gardens in Joplin, Missouri, and what Mike Sicosio is doing in Schenectady. And all of these folks have done part of our SAT talks. You can hear their stories right there. And then later on, we're going to actually do a webinar on kind of the overriding principles of what we call the Missions 3.0. It's a workshop that we do. It's a 6-hour. We're going to do a 1-hour workshop giving you the basic ideas of what it looks like for a church to kind of move intentionally in this direction over time. The other thing that we hope that you'll go look at, I mentioned that we have over 60 videos. We've done a TED Talk type of an event called SAT Talk. So we've got things in here from Andy Agaba's work in Africa, what they're doing with impact investing, Pastor Kevin Payton out of Ohio. We have stuff for business people and their idea of missions. And we've got pastors in here. Bob Lupton's in here. Just our whole idea was to create a platform and share the stories of folks like Faith to Action who are out there saying that. So we hope that that link should be in your chat as well. And we hope that you'll avail yourself of these upcoming webinars that we're doing along with the SAT Talk video platform as well. So I think I speak for all of the panelists in saying thank you for giving us this last 90 minutes of your time. We hope that you have been challenged and are willing to kind of step into this space and figure out how you might move your church in directions that make more sense, that we could be more of the kind of influence in the world that God would have when it comes to orphans and vulnerable children. Hey, if you have some further questions, feel free to send them on to Megan. You've got her information there. And we hope to see you back next week at the upcoming webinar. Rebecca, Mohammed, Nabs, Ellie, Dan, thank you all for being a part of this. Blessings to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Blessings to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining.